Here we are at the Combine. Very happy to be joined by former Browns quarterback and CBS and SiriusXM NFL analyst Brady Quinn. Brady, it is good to be with you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Glad to be here. Excited to see kind of what goes on this whole week. This is obviously a big moment for a lot of these guys.
Last year, you and I did about 15 minutes going through every quarterback possibility in that draft. The Browns drafted Baker Mayfield, set the NFL record for most passing touchdowns by a rookie. So we don't have to talk about quarterback this year. And for you as a former Browns quarterback, isn't that nice for this organization?
It's awesome. And I think as you and I were talking before we kind of jumped on this, the crazy part is it's not just Baker, too. Like, offensively, you're really not looking at too many positions. Say, we need help here, or we need someone here. This roster is stacked, and you know, looking at the Combine and just what's going to take course the next week or so, I thought Baker Mayfield really solidified his spot at being that #1 quarterback of last year's draft class at this event. You know, we don't know whether or not Kyler Murray will throw, not that that's even a subject we were going to talk about, but for Baker Mayfield, I thought when he did decide to throw, throwing against the other guys in that class, the way he performed, the way he looked, the way he handled himself, handled the interviews, I thought that solidified himself, and the Browns probably being pretty convinced at that point he was their guy, and then everything else kind of falling in around it. But, you know, for this draft, they're not worried about that. Not worried about quarterback, not really worrying about too many guys really on offense with the stars that they have. To me, it's going to be more defensively driven.
All right, you talk about this offense. You signed Greg Robinson, so you're set pretty much with your starters that you had a year ago, maybe some depth at tackle, maybe some depth at receiver as you go through it. But let's talk about just watching that offense and what Freddie Kitchens was able to do, parlaying that into becoming the head coach of the Browns. What do you think about what the Browns did over those final 8 games?
Well, I love the fact that, you know, they're playing some of their best football in the second half of the season, especially for a young team. I mean, that's the sort of growth, progression, and maturation process you like to see out of those guys. I love the fact that they kept the relationship between Freddie Kitchens and Baker Mayfield. I thought that was one of the hardest things to go through going from my second year to third year in Cleveland, having Rob Chudzinski my first couple years with an offense that I knew like the back of my hand, and then all of a sudden you had to scrap it, start over, and learn something new with Brian Daboll. So, you know, for him, that's going to be huge, and keeping that continuity of the system. A lot of the pieces, too, on the roster, usually with a coaching change comes a lot of those changes. You're not going to see that. So all those things really build well for this team. You mentioned it, really depth. I mean, that's what you're looking at with this roster right now. So looking at what the 17th spot they've got in the first round of this year's draft, I'm thinking more defense, but I wouldn't be shocked if it wasn't maybe best player available at that point. And if it was an offensive guy, you still take it because it's hard to turn those guys down.
You talk about defense, and a lot of people think maybe pass rusher, maybe interior defensive lineman, maybe linebacker or corner, and this draft seems to be pretty good on that side of the ball.
Yeah, I would say D-line would be the spot where I'd want to go. And the reason being is not so much that Cleveland necessarily needs it. You definitely could use someone who could get more production on opposite of Myles Garrett. I think Emmanuel Ogbah is decent. I just don't know that he's going to have the same type of impact as maybe some of the other edge rushers that we've got in this year's draft. It's a deep class, D-lineman edge rushers. That would be the spot I think at 17 you could go with. If they wouldn't move back and maybe acquire even more picks. We see teams do that a lot of times if they're not in love with someone. Cornerback potentially could be one, but this isn't necessarily, in my opinion, a great draft for some of those top-end quarterbacks. I think there's some guys with some value in this draft, but I don't know that I want to spend that pick necessarily on that one. And so it really comes down to how they value and who they value in this draft. Like I said before, it could be a guy that falls to them that's maybe an offensive lineman that they didn't think they'd have a shot at taking. You kind of have to take them for that depth. And we've seen other teams do that. The Saints did that a couple years ago with Ryan Ramczyk, and he ended up having to play because of injury, and so they were glad they made that pick, made that selection.
The Browns got an offensive line for depth last year, 33rd overall, Austin Corbett. You know, when you think about this team, you mentioned the turnover in the roster. It's been a year. I mean, we were sitting here a year ago, coming off season they hadn't won a game. A lot of questions on that roster. What do you think of the job John Dorsey has done in just kind of really remaking this franchise?
He's the mastermind, man. I mean, he and John we trust. I think if you're a Browns fan, and from the outside looking in, he came in with so much credibility where, I mean, even now being an analyst, you weren't really going to second guess a lot of his decision making because he had such a great track record of bringing in guys who were talented, guys who could play football, and not necessarily getting away from the analytics perspective, because I do think that in a way helped get Cleveland to the point where they had these picks, they could acquire them, but now getting in a guy who they really felt like he could bring in the right talent and then bring in the guys that the coaches are looking for and putting them in positions to be successful within their scheme. That's been huge, and so he's been a huge get for the Browns organization.
It'll be interesting to see this year the Browns dealing with something they haven't dealt with in a long time, expectations. And what is that like for this team, especially for a young team, to have to deal with that?
Ride it. I mean, I accept it. I think the fans should be excited about it. I'm sure, Baker's excited about it, being the face of this team. but go win the AFC North. I mean, that's the goal every year, but it just seems like now that this year it's a lot more legitimate, and it's a lot of what Cleveland's done. I think what they're going to do in free agency and what they're going to do in the draft too to add on to what they already have. The continuity that they have now with Freddie Kitchens taking over, and also looking at the rest of the division, right? You got Lamar Jackson now taking over. We'll see how that goes and how that progresses. You're not going to have a Pittsburgh Steelers team with Le'Veon Bell and Antonio Brown anymore. The Cincinnati Bengals have a new head coach, so there's a lot of transition around. If there's any time to seize the moment, it's now for the Browns.
All right, I'll have to end because it is the combine. You were a quarterback. You know that position very well, and I think a lot of people are just fascinated with Kyler Murray. What are you looking to see from him? What do you expect from him? What are your thoughts on him as a guy who, could clock in at, 5'9" today?
Yeah, everyone knows he's short. He's played, and he's probably been a short guy's entire life, and he's still been successful, right? He won like 4 state championships in the state of Texas in high school, and he won the Heisman, won the Big 12 last year in his first year starting, only year starting. So they know he's short. The weight's a concern. If he can get over 200 pounds, that's going to be huge. And his comp really is going to be Russell Wilson in that sense, right? A sub 6-foot guy who's going to be around 205, something like that. So then hand size becomes huge to be able to grip the football in those adverse weather conditions. That's going to be something to keep an eye on. But the other thing is whether or not he throws. I personally would love to see him throw because I think it sets up well for him because he's going to show out well with all these guys, and he's going to test well. If he does all the drills and everything else too, he'll run a fast 40, he'll do a fast L drill, all the other things that will make him look like not only just a solid quarterback but a tremendous talent too. So I'll be looking forward to seeing how he handles that portion of it, but then it's behind the scenes. How he handles the interview process, much like Baker last year, who I kind of mentioned, knocking it out of the park with a lot of teams, saying, look, some people have compared him to John Manziel. I'm not that guy, right? Yep. I think Kyler Murray's case, it's different. He's got to convince these teams that if year 1, year 2 doesn't go well, he's not going to say, I'm just going to go play baseball because I'm that good of an athlete and I got drafted in the first round there. So, the interview process will be huge for him too.
Dwayne Haskins, Ohio State. A lot of our fans obviously looking at Dwayne Haskins, seeing what he can do. What were your thoughts on the Buckeye?
He's who I think is the #1 quarterback prospect in this draft. I said it a couple times this past year calling some Ohio State games. He's got a strong arm. He can make all the throws. He can layer the throws, meaning throwing over a defender, but before the next defender into a certain spot in that zone coverage. Throws a great deep ball, and he's accurate. Throws from a consistent platform, good platform. Often, and really there's not really holes in his game. He works through his progressions well. He understands what a defense is trying to do and how to attack them. The only thing is sometimes when he gets off the spot a little bit, he struggles with suddenness to be able to move then to throw, something that Baker really excels at. So for Dwayne, I think that's something to work on, but that's really the only knock on this young guy, besides the fact that he only started 1 year. But he had a phenomenal year. I think he's going to be the first quarterback taken off the board.
Anybody else you're really excited to see at this year's Combine?
Gosh, Nick Bosa, obviously, I want to see what he's going to do at the Combine just because we only saw 3 games from him this past year and hasn't played a ton of football when you look at his career at Ohio State. So it'll be fun to watch him, see how he performs. Looking at the offensive lineman, it's a really deep group, and I think there's a lot of value there for a lot of teams. Whether it's Jonah Williams and kind of how he tests how long his arms are, that's the question with the tackles. We just want to know how long your arms are. If they're 34 inches, all right, you're good. You can play tackle. Otherwise, they bump those guys down to guard. So it's kind of funny the different things you're looking for at the Combine. A lot of times it's more about the measurements before we even go to the field and do those drills. That and then really the D-line. I mean, this D-line class might be one that we look back on in 5 years and say, man, there's some perennial Pro Bowlers who are part of that group. So I'm curious to see how Quinnen Williams looks, Rashawn Gary, who a lot of Cleveland fans probably don't want to hear about, but if you can have him on your team, he's a heck of a player. So curious to see how all those guys test and how they perform.
All right, final one. Bo Bishop, my co-host, said a while back that the Browns are going to be the consensus favorite to win the AFC North. He talked about some of the struggles, some of the turmoil around the Browns ascending. Are you willing to get on that bandwagon and say the Browns should win the AFC North this year?
Man, it's hard to say. Look, I think it's going to be between them and Pittsburgh. It's hard for me to bet against Pittsburgh or make a claim against Pittsburgh only because of their track record. And it'd be hard to see them just fall apart. I mean, look, as good as Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell have been and productive as they have been, they haven't won a Super Bowl during their time there. So, maybe some of those headaches, if they're gone, if they weren't great for the culture of your locker room, would be better for them moving forward. I'm definitely on the Browns bandwagon as far as wanting them to win, but whether or not they can beat Pittsburgh, that's going to be the biggest question. But yeah, I'm willing to go with Bo right now and say I think they're in the best position of all these teams in the AFC North to win it.
Certainly will be fun. Brady, thanks for the time. Enjoy the Combine.
Thanks for having me.